Good morning. So how many health people do we have here in the audience this morning? A lot of you. How about farm people or soil people? How many do we have? Oh, you're the only one. Okay. You're a minority today. And in fact, I hope you raised your hand when I asked about health people, because I spend a lot of time these days talking to people in the medical field, but also talking to people in the field of agriculture, and I kind of look at all of them as colleagues, really on the forefront of keeping communities healthy. And to be honest with you, in the past couple of years, I've started to look at farmers as maybe being a little bit more important to our well-being than my colleagues, the physicians. So hats off to you in the blue shirt. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about the larger ecology of eating. And I don't know how much you had of that yesterday, but this is a wonderful conference, and it's so great that it's sponsored by Slow Food, because it really is taking the idea of nutrition out of the realm of micronutrients, which is something we hold on to so strongly within biomedicine, and really trying to look at the larger arena of the nutrient chain. And hopefully I'm going to expand that a little bit more and literally bring you back to the soil. But I do need to frame, where I work, and this is actually where I spend a lot of my week still, in an 8x10 office. I do have a pretty picture on my wall, but it's as sterile as any medical office. It's got a fluorescent light. And this is where I do a lot of my medical care, but in the past bunch of years, I've been spending more and more time out on farms and learning from farmers and people who tend our soil, and really trying to make those connections, those health connections. And it's gotten to the point where I am now, just as a result of that, seen by my farmer colleagues as someone who is sort of an expert in this field of nutrition and agroecology, sort of the link between the two. So not long ago, actually in September, I was invited by the FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture arm of the UN, to give one of the talks at one of their first meetings on agroecology and nutrition in Rome. And while I was there, I decided to take a little side trip to the Marche region. Has anybody been to the Marche in Italy? It's a beautiful, beautiful part of Italy on the Adriatic coast, not very touristy, but still has a lot of the local farms and really the very traditional farming systems that have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, where in one property you will grow this incredible biodiversity of food and really maintain your family that way, in these little patchworks of fields. And it really is going back to an old way of farming. Everybody has their own olive trees. Everybody has their own grains that they grow. Now, the Marche, each part of Italy kind of has its own thing that they're famous for. And, Perugia is famous for chocolates, and Tuscany is famous for wine. But the Marche, what it's actually most famous for is ultra longevity. They have more centenarians there per 10,000 population than anywhere else in Europe and almost anywhere else in the world. It's really something they're quite proud of. And as I spent some time in the Marche, and I have to confess, I'm a little bit of an ultra-centenarian tourist. I've spent a lot of time going around the world, to places where there's long-lived people. And in fact, one book that I wrote called The Jungle Effect is exactly about that. I went to these places I called cold spots, where they still had very low rates of chronic disease, and tried to unpackage the traditional diets that were there. So this has been a habit of mine for a long time, to go to these kinds of places. But what I found out about the Marche was that the reason it has this special longevity is really because of the Benedictine tradition that's there. Any Benedictines in the room? well, honestly, after spending time with these Benedictine monks and nuns, I've decided we should all become Benedictine because they've really got it right. I mean, they do make these wonderful spirits, but their philosophy is this philosophy of ora y labora, where you pray and you work, and work for them is working the soil. And they do it all like 7 or 8 times a day, pray, work, and it's just this kind of joyful existence. And then, of course, they have to take breaks to drink their spirits. And these monasteries are filled with 100-year-olds, like everybody's. I'm 97, I'm 98. In fact, I went to and visited this Sœur Bernadette, who's completely famous, because she's just about to turn 100, and she still climbs trees to pick fruit. And I saw her do it. I had to chase her around to interview her. And then the reason we're sitting down was because she looked at me and she thought I looked tired. So she was like, sit down and I'll talk to you. And everybody's turning 100 there. This is a birthday party that I went to that was in town. And the woman in the middle is the birthday girl, and those are her 2 sisters, her much younger sisters. One's 96 and one's 98. And it was quite the festivity. But what was so interesting, this woman's name was Elvira, the one in the middle. And after the birthday party, I met Elvira's grandson. And I asked him, I said, this is so amazing, this community that you've come from with the Benedictine tradition and working in the fields and the ora y labora and all this fantastic food and the ultra longevity and all this. And he was standing there smoking a cigarette. He had these like 2 pierces in his eyebrows, and he's like, none of that interests me. He said, I like McDonald's, you know. And it really struck me. It just brought home this phenomenon that we're seeing around the world, this idea of, people have different ways of addressing it. They call it the longevity paradox or the migration effect or the nutrition transition, but it's this idea that there's this older generation that really was connected to a rich tradition of how we grew our food and made our food and ate our food, and then a next generation which really has disconnected from it. And one has to wonder if that has something to do with these soaring rates of chronic disease and obesity and so on that we're seeing. And in fact, I know this is a very US-focused meeting, but when you go around the world and look at what happens to cultures, in each one of these is a ethnicity or group that's gone from a rural area to their more urbanized area. And this is looking at prevalence of diabetes. Sorry, these slides didn't translate quite well. But you see how the prevalence of diabetes goes way up as we go through this nutrition transition or migration to a more modernized, more industrialized way of eating. And this is a slide looking specifically at childhood obesity, and we see that it's not just in the US, but around the world, in Africa and Asia. In Latin America, interestingly, it started up a little higher, but is kind of staying flat. Maybe it's the soda tax in Mexico, that's maybe different. But we are, seeing the same thing, this terrible transition. So as we have these discussions on what is causing this degeneration in our health, even for those who are living longer, they're living with way more years of disability. What is this? We tend to go to what has been added, the bad things that have come into our diet. So we talk about the Coca-Cola, we talk about the supersizing and the fast food and the sedentary lifestyles. We talk about smoking. But what I want to focus on in the next bit is what we've lost. The things that have been taken away from us as we have made this transition, and how those protective factors might be as important as all the bad things that have been added in. And I'm going to, for the sake, I know that most of you in the room are not agriculturalists. We have only one. So don't get frightened. This isn't suddenly turning into a talk on agronomy. I'm going to keep it very simple. But I am going to talk about these 5 ideas of crop diversity and perennials and native seeds and traditional technologies and soil vitality and community as being these 5 integral things that were a part of that marque and a part of a lot of what we see in these ultra longevity spots around the world and try and understand what they are and how we could potentially regain them and regain our health. So let's start with crop diversity. And in order to talk about this, I actually want to bring you to Copper Canyon in Mexico, where I spent some time doing research for that book I referred to earlier, the book called The Jungle Effect. Has anybody been down into the Barrancas de Cobre, right down into the canyons themselves? There's like a little tourist train that goes along the top where you can buy knickknacks. But if you go down into the canyons, that's where the Tarahumara Indians live. And they have kept their culture very intact, mainly by isolating themselves from nosy people like me who want to go down and find out about them. And certainly from not getting involved with the larger predominant culture in Mexico and not adopting a lot of the laws, the traditions, and foodstuffs. And the Tarahumara are very well known. Tarahumara literally means those who walk well, and they walk sometimes for hundreds of miles on these certain races that they do. There's kind of ultra runners, and so there's other parts of their lifestyle other than what they eat that are also incredibly health-giving. And they live in these little rancheros that are just up there in the cliff canyons. But what's so fascinating about the Tarahumara from a medical standpoint is that they are the genetic cousins to the Pima Indians of Arizona. And the Pima have some of the highest rates, as you know, of diabetes in the world. I mean, by the time you're in your 20s or 30s, I think you have something like a 40 to 60% chance of developing at least insulin resistance if you're living within the Pima community. Whereas the Tarahumara have these very, very low rates. And as you go down into the canyons, they get even lower. You virtually just do not see diabetes. So we know it's not a genetic thing, or if it's a genetic thing, it's definitely turned on or off by epigenetics, by something around those genes, right? So what's really fascinating, if you look at what the Tarahumara eat, is it's all about this finely tuned diversity of their diet, and specifically what they call the tres hermanas, or three sisters of their meal, which is the squash, the corn, and the beans. And these three plants, if you look at them from the agricultural standpoint, they make perfect sense, because squash is actually this incredibly corn is this incredibly nitrogen-hungry plant. It really will, if you plant it in your garden and don't then put something else, after a while it's going to completely deplete your soil. But beans, it turns out, are this very generous nitrogen giver. So putting them together actually keeps this nice cycle going and keeps a good balance in the soil. But then when you look at it from the nutritional standpoint, and here it is translated into a traditional Tarahumara meal. And by the way, the corn that they grow is this traditional varietal of Zea maize. It's not the kind of corn or tortilla that we get here. I mean, literally you can use these tortillas to like scrub the corns off your feet, or take the ring out of your bathtub or something like that. It's got, and lots of taste, like you eat one of those tortillas and you're just full. It's super nutty, delicious, and very nutrient dense. But look at this from a glycemic standpoint in terms of how the sugar from these foods is released into your gut. So on the top you have the beans, and they're a relatively low glycemic food. Their glycemic index is around 22, which for those of you who are nutrition experts in the room, you're like, yeah, that's pretty good. I'd advise that for my diabetic patients. The tortilla, on the other hand, has a relatively high glycemic index in that it pushes sugar into your bloodstream rather rapidly. What happens when you combine them and make your taco? Come on, you guys, you gotta show me you're awake. You get the average, it brings it down. Food combinations make a difference, which many of you already know. But it's so incredible how what works in the field also works in your gut and works, it sort of makes a sense as this low glycemic, almost anti-diabetic food. And you see this around the world as you look at diversity, crop diversity, and food combinations as they come to you out of the field. And it is sort of this beautiful poetry that happens when you suddenly start to link back to how things are meant to be in the season. Here's another example. This is from Crete, another place where I've spent some time working. And this is just the farmer's market on Crete, and you go there through the seasons and you see a whole different palette of foods. Now, Ansel Keys is this very famous epidemiologist. He's actually a physiologist, but a researcher who did the 7-country study starting in the 1960s, trying to figure out who had the lowest rates of heart attacks in the world. And he actually, ended up being the men on Crete who were sort of the superstars, who came out, with having the best lipid profiles, the lowest rates of MI, and so on. And there were lots of problems with Ansel's research. Through the retrospectoscope, we can have a lot of issues with it. But it really did pinpoint that diet, the Mediterranean diet, as being this ultra-longevity diet. And specifically, as you know, there are many Mediterranean diets. I mean, there's many countries around that sea, but specifically what they eat in Greece. So Antonia Trikopoulou is a modern-day epidemiologist in Greece who wanted to sort of unpackage that diet and figure out what are those protective cardiovascular foods, those superfoods that are keeping people healthy within the Mediterranean diet. So she assigned them all special scores and did an odds ratio of death for each food. And basically, if it's greater than 1, then it contributes to death. If it's less than 1, it's protective. So you see that this is the hazard odds ratio for death on the right side. Can you guys see these slides at all? You can. Well, is there somebody up front who can tell me what they see on these slides? Like if you take red meat and compare that to fruits and vegetables, red meat being something maybe you think is not so great for your health. What do you see? It's over 1, but a lot over 1? No. Are the vegetables a lot under 1? How about even sugar and sweet foods? Are they a lot over 1? No. Nothing, everything's kind of around 1. There was really nothing that emerged as this fantastic protective factor. So what's the answer? What's the superfood? All of it. It's this. It's the meze, it's the combination of all these little, it's the recipes. And it's the seasons that produce these foods and the way that they come from the soil. And in fact, as we're now beginning to study dietary diversity, as a risk factor for obesity, we're finding that there is an absolute inverse correlation. To my knowledge, this has not been done yet with children, so you researchers in the room, it's time that we start to look at this with kids. But with adults, it's been shown that it's inversely related to BMI and inversely related to waist to height ratio. And this is, Q5 is this is a dietary diversity scale, with Q5 being the most diverse and Q1 the least diverse. So very much of a predictor. And this, for me, is completely fascinating. If you look at global burden of disease, and this was published in Lancet in 2010, actually it was published in 2012, it's from 2010. And finally, they're starting to unpackage what's really behind those things that are killing us in this world, cardiovascular disease now being the main thing across the globe. And as they start to unpackage it, they realize that a diet low in fruits is number 4 in terms of risk factors. Diet low in nuts and seeds, diet low in whole grains, and diet low in vegetables, and diet low in omega-3 fatty acids. Those are what are really behind those numbers. So once again, getting at this idea of diversity. So this is a biodynamic farm in Washington State where I did a farming internship. And these are kids who get their CSA box from the farm. And they're taking their little tour on the hay ride when their mother comes to pick up the box. This is their popsicle, is a daikon, a daikon from the field, a raw daikon. That's pretty amazing. How many of you sit and chew on raw daikon here in the room? One. We got one daikon lover. But these are kids who've been raised on this kind of diversity. So just to this is how it translates into real life. So in terms of perennials and native seeds, another very important factor. just think, with rice alone, we used to have, about 50 years ago, it was easy to find about 40,000 varietals of rice on the globe. And people were eating them. You know, every village in Thailand had their own 3 varietals that were special to them. Now, across the world, there's kind of one rice that we all eat, predominantly. It's called Uncle Ben's. Low in nutrients. I mean, these varietals were way richer in all kinds of micronutrients. They were much more drug tolerant. They worked specifically with the land in which they originated. There was many things to argue for them. They might have not produced in the same kind of yield, and they certainly didn't produce the same kind of carbohydrate or sweetness as Uncle Ben's, and they, couldn't be controlled by a company. But we really have just lost this tremendous biodiversity. And with that loss of biodiversity, I would argue that we have also lost our medicine. And this is something that is fascinating me more and more and is sort of leading to new projects. But let me give you an example of it once again from the Tarahumara. This is a typical ranchero where they live. What do you see growing out front there? Nopales, cactus. Well, remember I told you that the Tarahumara have these really low rates of diabetes compared to the Pima? So, of course, the Pima are living in Arizona where you have fast food, you have deep fried tacos, maybe you have your pickup truck so you're not exercising, there's all these other things. But look at what these guys have in front of their house. They have a plant which ethnobotanists have discovered is incredibly hypoglycemic. It actually lowers blood sugar levels. And they're not sure if it's a substance that's kind of glycophage-like that actually works in the liver to store sugar. They're still trying to understand exactly how it works, but it really does have this kind of anti-diabetic effect. And in fact, when ethnobotanists went into that region and started to look at a lot of the traditional plants that grew there, they found that there were over 300 species of wild plants growing in that area that had hypoglycemic effects. So when you think of people migrating to a new culture and within a generation or two starting to have the disease rates of the predominant community, or maybe even worse, it's not just the foods they're getting in the new place, it's the medicines they're leaving behind. And I think that's a really important idea to hold on to. This is another example from Crete. This is Katerina, who I went orta hunting in the mountains with her. And when you start to actually look at what orta has, which are these wild greens, by the way, I don't know if you can tell, but her bag is like completely full and mine was like a quarter the amount. It's not easy to orta hunt. And you need like one special really long fingernail to get them out of these wild greens. And actually her mother, when we went back to the house, I saw her mother throw out my whole bag or feed it to the chickens. So I don't even know if I was picking the right stuff. But when you look at the wild greens and what's in there, and you totally cannot see this slide, but it's this long list of nutrients, and it's really quite amazing. They are these, way more powerful than any supplement or any, packaged super drink that you could dream up. And here this summer I spent a month in Finland and Sweden and was running along a trail in the little community of Jarno one day and came across this lovely triplet. I think they must have been bicycling beforehand because I don't think it's so dangerous to blueberry pick that you need to wear a helmet, but they're very cautious in Sweden. So it might be that they were just wearing the helmets to do blueberry picking. But these, once again, are these incredible bombs which also have your daily value for alpha-linolenic acid, which is an omega-3 fat. And it makes sense because they spend their winters in darkness and they need all that sort of good anti-depression protection during the summer. But also flavonoids and anthocyanins, and once again, glucoquinone, which is once again a blood sugar lowering. And these are not blueberries, they're bilberries. So they have a little bit more oomph than blueberries, but and apparently like a quarter of the land in Sweden is covered with bilberry bushes. So once again, this medicine that's just there. So I want to move on to traditional technologies and innovation, and I want to be really clear as I'm talking about this section. I am not a Luddite. I'm not just this romantic person who believes that what happened 100 years ago is good and that we should all throw out our computers and take our shoes off and just go back to the land. But for me, it is this idea of how do we learn from this and meld it with what we have that's modern and good. And this is a guy, Gary Cox, who's given a lot of thought about this. He's a chicken farmer in Arkansas, and I've spent some quality time with him. He's also a gold miner character. He owns a plot of land up in Alaska, I think, where he goes and pans for gold. But Gary was a money guy, and he wanted to make a lot of money off of eggs. So he realized that there was a business to be made. So he started this business, which was growing these. It first started off in crates, and then decided to move them to these hen houses. And this is 15,000 hens to a house producing eggs that they get packed off to Costco and Walmart. And it's hell in one of those houses. I don't know if any of you have ever been into them. Also spent some quality time in places like this. Absolute hell. And Gary realized it was hell. He also realized that his workers' costs were going through the roof because there's absolutely no more dangerous profession than working in these houses in terms of lung health and so on. And absolutely soaring rates of lung disease, the workers that do this. So Gary saw the light and he converted over to a pasture-based system. And it actually required a lot of technology to do so. He needed these, very new-fangled sort of polypropylene tents, and he made these new little houses for, roosting during the night, and these different irrigation systems, and because he wanted to do it on a kind of mass scale, not just your cute little pasture-raised hen house that gives you 20 eggs a day. And he did it over quite a few acres. So it was an interesting idea of going back to the old way of raising your eggs, but doing it using a lot of modern technology. And by the way, just in case you're curious, the old hen house was free-range organic. When you're buying those eggs, that's what you were getting, is that packed house. Because look, they're free-range, right? And you can feed them organic mash. This is pasture. So those $9 a dozen ones that are like on the top shelf of Whole Foods, those are the ones on the right, and that's the ones that are $4.50 a dozen or whatever. So just for you to know. But when they just published a study in Italy looking at the nutrient value between these two kinds of eggs, and it's astounding what that kind of old technology gives you. If you look in terms of vitamin E, in the bar, the furthest to the right is the pasture-based. You see that organic is basically the same as conventional, the free-range organic, in terms of all these nutrient values. Beta-carotene, lutein, zeaxanthin, and I actually didn't put DHA on there. And these are not DHA-fed hens. It's just the DHA they make from being on pasture. It's much higher on the pasture side. And when you think about it from a pediatric standpoint, these are all things that help develop the brain. So here we have this old-fashioned technology, this way of growing your eggs that's translating into much healthier food for our kids and a much healthier metabolism, I might argue, as well. This next idea is something that I, at this point, have absolutely no solid proof about. And I want to come out and say this right now. This is an idea that has just been floated to me while I was in Italy, and I want to share it with you, but absolutely with the caveat that more research needs to be done. Did you hear me on that? Because I don't want you walking out of here and saying, she said, but this is something that they are starting to study at this Grain Research Institute in Italy, and it looks very, very compelling. They just haven't published the first papers on it yet. But what they've realized is that in Italy, all of the grain is harvested and dried in the field. That is the rule in Italy. And it used to be that way in the United States. This is actually not Italy, this is Nebraska 70 years ago or whatever. And that's how we used to do it in the States. But it's economically not feasible to do that anymore because the way the farmers do their farming and these big mega farms is they do wheat, soy, and corn in these rotations. And so they gotta get the wheat out of there so they can put their soy crop in. And even though, you know, they realize that there are certain advantages to field drying, they have to harvest in the combine and then they put it into these drying bins and bring the wheat up to 140 degrees. So using these new ways of farming that were not used before. Now what they're finding in Strombelli, Italy, in this institute, and it hasn't been looked into at all here other than in terms of quality of baking, but not in terms of what it's actually doing in our guts, is that by moving these grains up to very high heats rather than using the sun to dry them, you're actually creating a denatured grain. And that's the ones on the bottom. You can see they almost they look, you guys can't see any of this, take my word for it. These are, you know, these scans of it where rather than having the typical architecture of the grain, it really, everything in it is getting denatured by the heat. It's taking on this completely different shape. And what they're starting to wonder in Italy is if this might have something to do with this massive epidemic of gluten sensitivity that we're seeing. And it's something that we haven't even begun to think about here. We're so focused on the gluten and the nutrient and not really thinking about the connection to farming and the way, the farming traditions that we have and the way that we're doing it. So these are just an example of how we have to start to think in a full cycle from farm to gut. Soil vitality is another very important thing in terms of thinking of what we've lost. And this is Cody Holmes, who's a rancher in the Ozarks in Missouri. And I spent some time interning with him. And Cody has gone back to the old way of ranching and these herd, sort of mob grazing, where you move your herd in these very intense populations around your land and use them to fertilize your soil and rejuvenate your soil, rather than letting them just kind of pasture willy-nilly. Really trying to imitate the way the bison roamed around the middle states and how they used to take a whole year to come back to where they started. And what they've shown is that this makes a tremendous difference in terms of soil vitality and also in terms of the biodiversity of what you're actually growing in that soil. And when researchers have looked at this way of farming, and also within organic farming, so typical organic farming, what they found is that there is way more microbial diversity in the soil of farms that are treated in this ecological way than in farms that are treated in a conventional way, and certainly that are treated with pesticides and herbicides that are going to kill microbial life in the soil. So here you have a study that was done by John Reganold comparing an organic field to a conventional field. This was a strawberry field, by the way, in Watsonville. And each specific dot is a unique type of microbial DNA. Above the blue line is organic, below the blue line is conventional. What do you see? Just absolute diversity in the organic. And in the conventional, really homogeneity. This is not quantity of microbes, you understand? This is diversity of microbes, because they mapped unique types of DNA. The conventional fields had microbes in them. It was kind of like a country club where everybody looks the same, you know? Whereas in the organic field, it was like an international city. And when they looked at nutrient content from these two fields, they found that even in the first growing year, there was a 10% increase in ascorbic acid and phenolics and antioxidant activity in the organic field compared to the conventional. And this is only after year one, and presumably with each year it's going to increase because you're increasing your microbial mass. So there's this direct link between microbial diversity and nutrient value of our food, or soil vitality and nutrient value of our food. And Pedro Artunis, who's in Canada, has actually discovered that there are specific microbes whose job it is to harvest nutrients from specific plants. There's kind of this lock and key phenomenon. So for example, there's the azobacter works with the pomegranate to give you magnesium and copper and zinc and manganese and iron and so there's and calcium. So there's these specific relationships happening between microbes, plants, and the nutrients that you get. Things that we don't think about when we're thinking about nutrients within the clinical realm, right? All of these relationships. Not only that, but we're starting to discover that there's actually a direct interbiome communication between our gut and the soil. And this is very new, very evolving data, but I spent some time in Europe working with these two sets of researchers who also work with each other. Erika von Mutius, who's the head of asthma and allergy at Munich Children's Hospital, and Tari Hatala and Ilkka Hanski, who are in Finland at Helsinki Children's Hospital. And Ilkka, by the way, the guy all the way over on the left, is an ecologist. I can't tell you how rare that is, to have a physician and an ecologist teaming up to do research together. That's me in the middle, in case you didn't. And that's Tari's, a picture of Tari behind him because he's been chair of the hospital for so long. But what they've been studying is the farm effect in Europe, and why is it that these kids who are raised on ecological farms have lower rates of asthma and allergy, seem to have just better functioning immune systems. And by the way, a subset of their analysis, and this is something that wasn't published, showed that their BMIs were much lower as well. And of course, they're on farms, they're working, there's all these other reasons, but they've showed that even kids who are raised eating off those farms have some of that benefit, like children who are in Steiner schools. So this is the farm effect in a nutshell. And, there's a lot going on in this picture, and I know I'm standing here in an institution of higher medical learning, so we probably shouldn't even talk about that bucket way over on the left, which contains raw milk. Let's just suffice to say that this kid is bathing in microbes, right? The mom's in the back tossing hay. I think it's so funny that, we call allergies hay fever. And then these kids have such low rates of hay fever, the mom's like throwing the hay in the air. And that cow is not tied up, by the way. The child's tied up. Crazy. When they went, they cultured the farms to look at what kind of diversity of microbes they could find on these farms. And then they took, as a control, they looked at kids with asthma in the urban setting and cultured their ecosystem, their environment. And what they found, and the red line is the kids with asthma, the blue line is the kids on the farms, and what this is measuring on the y-axis is diversity of microbes. Not quantity, again, but diversity. And they found that the kids on the farm were just, once again, bathing in a diversity of microbes, whereas the kids in the city really had much more homogeneity. And by the way, the kids on the farm, they were finding Shigella, Salmonella, Listeria, all those things that make your skin crawl. But they were in these happy combinations with lots of things that are considered more commensal bacteria. So, when you hear about Listeria being cultured on a farm and how that's the end of the world and we should recall all the food from the farm, I think you can culture Listeria pretty much from every farm, So just for you to understand that. Now, Tari Hatala, the guy who's the head of asthma and allergy at Helsinki, he's taken this data and has just gone crazy with it and is starting to do a lot of very amazing ecological studies on it. But one of the things he really has started to push forward is this biodiversity hypothesis to replace what he looks at as kind of the old and tired hygiene hypothesis. And what he's shown is that as we're losing biodiversity on the globe, which is the chart on your left, and those are measured by the Living Planet Index and a bunch of other indices, we are increasing all of our chronic and inflammatory diseases, and that these are really happening in lockstep, and that a lot of what we're seeing in terms of modern illness in children and adults is related to this loss of biodiversity in our ecosystem. So what do I tell my kids? I tell just dust it off a little, but go ahead and eat it, as long as it's coming from a healthy farm. The last thing I want to talk about really briefly, because I know we're almost out of time here, is this idea of community. And this is a picture from the archives in Kentucky. And once again, here I am in a medical institution, not wanting at all to romanticize tobacco. But it's kind of amazing when you spend time, as I have, in a lot of these farming communities in Kentucky, and begin to understand the role that tobacco farming played in the community 50, 60 years ago. And that it was a way, it was, these were small-scale farmers, and it was a way of bringing families together, and everybody would participate in the harvest. And it was, tobacco, by the way, was one crop grown amongst your beans and your corn and many other things. And this idea of, of that old system bringing families together and actually giving them these health-giving behaviors is something that Luigi taught me when I was in Italy. He was a farmer. I spent time with him in his little region, and every night he was the cook in the family, and the whole family came together to eat. And this is from some time that I spent on Okinawa for the jungle effect, but when the family comes together to eat, then all the research shows people eat more slowly. They eat more of a diversity of food. They eat less, and so on and so forth. And you have these rules, these nutrition rules that get handed down, like the idea from Japan of harahachibu, or eat until you are only 8 parts full. So, leave that little 20% on the plate. This is an example from a farming tradition from Crete that's very tied to the Greek Orthodox religion, but this idea of the Lenten fasts that are mainly kept not in urban areas, but by people who are still very much in their agrarian lifestyle, of giving up decadent foods for at least 180 days a year for these various fasts. And when researchers study these folks, they show that they have lower rates of lipids around the year. So these agricultural traditions that then translate into healthy family traditions and food traditions. So we've lost these things. We've lost crop diversity and perennials and traditional technologies and soil vitality and community. And they've translated very literally into these health losses of dietary diversity and loss of phytonutrients and loss of healthy macronutrients and protected bacteria and healthy eating patterns. Well, how do we discover this pharmacy? How do we do this? I'm not asking all of you to move your patients and yourselves back to the fields. I'm really a big advocate of bringing the fields into the city, and that's something I work on a lot, and trying to create these healthy connections between us and the farmlands that are around us. But what I'm really inviting you to do is start to think of the cycle of health, especially related to obesity, as being something that's doesn't just start with the nutrient or even the food. I know we're starting to feel like we're getting expansive in terms of thinking about whole foods in obesity, how radical that we're not just thinking about micronutrients anymore. But I want you to go back to the whole cycle and literally go back to the microbes in the soil and really think about that. And I showed you the picture of the kids in the bicycle helmets. They were from this little idyllic village in Sweden called Järna, which is really this intentional community that was built on the Rudolf Steiner model. And it's almost too precious and too perfect, and you sort of believe that maybe behind the doors everybody's stabbing and poisoning each other because they just seem to love each other too much and be too happy. But I went there and gave a series of lectures this summer, and everybody, these are the community leaders, including that elfin man in the front, who I would see sitting in the trees occasionally. There's a lot of tree sitting this summer. But they have this culture centrum there. And Järna is sort of what we all aim to be. They have a soil museum, okay? This is an entry to the town. And this is the school, which is literally placed in the fields. So the children are sort of playing in the fields. And there are no rules about where you can go, and they seem to be playing with pickaxes. I don't know. They're very safe on one end, but then they let the children just wander in the woods. It's quite wonderful. This is the hospital in the community, and never mind the fact that they didn't seem to have any pharmaceuticals. This was like all Dr. Hauschka stuff in the pharmacy. But the hospitals themselves are set in the fields. So the patients are looking out onto these beautiful varietal wheat fields. Even the parking lots have farms in them. Once again, you see the safety things. They have all these safety vests on the kids as they're running through the parking lots. And all the farmers are involved in research. This is a farmer publishing his findings on microbial counts related to different types of things that he's growing, and also looking at carbon sequestration in his field, which, by the way, is another huge, wonderful health byproduct of this kind of diversified farming, is you can actually move carbon from the air back into the soil. And so you're literally saving the planet by farming this way. But what I want you to think of in this room, since a lot of you probably are involved in the health sciences, is how can you start to join hands with people in the earth sciences to ask bigger questions, longer questions, deeper questions, and come up with studies that are kind of like this one that came out in Hawaii. And of course, it only made it into a rather small medical journal because we don't know how to even process this kind of stuff within the big biomedical journals. But it was really looking at childhood obesity through the lens of a whole food system. And they developed this model, and producers, by the way, up there in the upper left-hand corner, that means farmers. I don't know why they couldn't bring themselves to put the word farmer in this. But really trying to understand obesity through this larger ecological lens, and it was a really wonderful study. Or this kind of thing that's happening at Yale University. I went and gave grand rounds there last year in the Department of Psychiatry, because they realized they've hit the wall with a lot of their complex psychiatric diseases in terms of handing out all these medications, and they're starting to look at what community gardening does, even for working with people who are bipolar disorder, who are getting these sort of repeated hospitalizations or going through the turnstile in their mental health system. And so they're starting these community gardens, and in the middle there, that's the chair of the department, and they're bringing the farmers markets to the mental hospital there and actually selling out front. Or this wonderful program, because I believe that eco-literacy is actually a vital sign. And that if you really want to assess if your children are going to do well in this world, it's if they truly know how to plant a seed and what soil looks like and where their food comes from. And so these kinds of programs like Education Outside, how many of you went on the tour this morning to the community gardens that we started? Okay, not enough of you. Please all go and visit their programs. These are connecting, bringing the outdoor classroom into the schools from early childhood onward. I'm on their board, and so full disclosure, I'm a huge supporter of what they do. But it's a fantastic organization here, and we need to start to ask research questions like this, like for this microbial diversity. How does it directly relate to our health? We need to start to make these links. How does it link into the microbial diversity of our gut? We have to start to ask economic questions like, okay, this is an economic model for why we should be drying the wheat in those bins, but when we start to factor in the human health factor, is it still make sense for us to do that? We need to start to look at those parameters. And in order to do that, I know it's hard. I know it's hard to go outside of your discipline and speak to people who are coming at it from a completely different place. We have these huge artificial divides between our earth sciences and our human sciences in this country. And so I'm going to give you a common language to do that. And that common language is this. Here's a cross-section of your skin and a cross-section of soil. Just squint a little bit. Kind of looks the same, huh? Or a cross-section of your gut and a cross-section of soil. Kind of looks the same, huh? The layers and everything. Or here it is from the electron microscope level. Can you tell which one is the villi in the gut interacting with the microbes in your gut, or which are the roots, the rhizomes in the soil interacting with the microbes in the soil? You really can't. Because guess what? We are soil. It's where we come from. Thank you so much.